You've been told you're intimidating, that you ask too many questions, that you make people uncomfortable. But what if I told you that 2,400 years ago, a man was literally executed for the same thing you're doing right now, and that his crime is actually your greatest power? Socrates, the father of Western philosophy, was sentenced to death for asking questions that expose the ignorance of powerful men. And if you're watching this video, you're probably committing the same crime every single day. Have you ever been in a meeting where you asked a simple clarifying question and suddenly the room went silent, where you could feel the temperature drop because you dared to point out an inconsistency in someone's logic? Or maybe you've been on a date where a man confidently explained something to you, and when you gently corrected him with actual facts, his entire demeanor shifted from charming to cold. That moment when you realized your intelligence wasn't an asset, it was a threat. Here's what nobody's telling you. You're not intimidating because you're aggressive, loud, or domineering. You're intimidating because you're awake in a world that profits from women staying asleep. You see through the performance. You notice the contradictions. You ask the questions that make people's carefully constructed facades crumble. And that makes you dangerous. In 399 BC, the city of Athens put Socrates on trial. The official charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. But let's be honest about what really happened. Socrates walked through the marketplace asking powerful men to justify their beliefs, to explain their reasoning, to defend their supposedly expert opinions. And one by one, he exposed that these men, these leaders, politicians, and respected citizens had no idea what they were talking about. They were performing intelligence, not possessing it. Socrates wasn't killed for being smart. He was killed for making everyone else realize they were pretending to be smart. Does this sound familiar? Every time you've questioned a decision at work and been labeled difficult. Every time you've asked a man to explain his contradictory behavior and been called crazy. Every time you've refused to accept a non-answer and been told you're overthinking. You weren't being unreasonable. You were being Socratic. And just like Socrates, you're being punished for it. But here's the extraordinary part. Research shows that only 3 to 5% of women operate at this level of intellectual independence and critical analysis. Most women have been successfully conditioned to doubt their perceptions, to accept contradictions, to smile and nod when they know something is wrong. But you're in that rare minority who refuses to unsee what you've seen. You refuse to unknow what you know. And that puts you in the same lineage as one of history's greatest philosophical minds. When you ask questions that reveal inconsistencies, you're not being difficult, you're being Socratic. When you refuse to accept surface-level explanations, you're not being demanding. You're practicing the same intellectual rigor that built Western civilization. The men who are intimidated by you aren't intimidated by your intelligence. They're terrified you'll expose their lack of it. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your intelligence threatens the people around you, how to weaponize it strategically instead of apologizing for it, and why the same quality that got Socrates executed is the secret to commanding respect in every relationship and situation you enter. In the next 30 minutes, you'll discover why brilliant men have always feared brilliant women, and more importantly, how to turn that fear into power. But before we understand why your intelligence is so threatening, we need to understand what happens when you don't use it, when you dim your light to make others comfortable. Because that's exactly what society is conditioning you to do.
Here's what nobody tells you. Every time you've pretended not to know the answer, every time you've let someone else take credit for your insight, every time you've played dumb to make a man feel smart, you weren't being kind. You were participating in your own intellectual assassination. Think about the last meeting where you had a solution but waited to see if anyone else would say it first. You know that moment, right? When the idea is fully formed in your mind, but you hesitate because you don't want to seem like you're showing off or stepping on toes. And then, inevitably, some guy says a diluted version of your idea 10 minutes later, and everyone acts like he's a genius. And you sit there thinking, I should have just said it. But you didn't. Because somewhere along the line, you learned that being right too often makes you unlikable. Or let's talk about dating. You've hidden your graduate degree in your profile. You've laughed at jokes that weren't funny. You've asked a man to explain things you already understand because you read somewhere that men need to feel useful. You've watched yourself perform intellectual modesty across a dinner table, making yourself smaller, less threatening, more palatable. And then you wondered why you attracted men who couldn't keep up with you, men who felt insecure around your success, who made passive-aggressive comments about your intelligence, who needed you to be less so they could feel like more. This didn't happen by accident. You were trained for this. Your grandmother was told that being too educated would make her unmarriageable. Your mother learned to preface her opinions with, "I'm probably wrong, but..." You watched the smart girls in school get called annoying, while the quiet ones got called sweet. You absorbed thousands of micro-messages that your intelligence was a liability, not an asset. That it made you difficult, aggressive, unfeminine. Too much. And here's the catastrophic part. It worked. You internalized it so deeply that you don't even notice when you're doing it anymore. It's automatic. You soften your language. You phrase statements as questions. You apologize before sharing expertise. You let men interrupt you and then thank them for their input. You've become so skilled at intellectual self-erasure that you genuinely believe you're just being collaborative, considerate, a team player. But let me tell you what's really happening. Every question you don't ask is training your colleagues that your perspective doesn't matter. Every insight you don't share is teaching your partner that he doesn't need to consider your intellect. Every challenge you don't make is confirming to everyone around you that you're not a serious thinker. You're not being kind, you're being complicit in your own irrelevance. The cost of this is staggering. Career advancement you'll never see because you made yourself forgettable. Promotions that went to louder, less qualified men who never questioned whether they deserved to speak. Relationships with intellectual equals you'll never have because you kept attracting men who needed you diminished. And perhaps most devastating, the slow erosion of self-respect that comes from betraying yourself thousands of times until you're not even sure who you are anymore. Research in women's psychology shows a direct correlation between inauthenticity and depression. When you perform a version of yourself that's strategically smaller, your nervous system knows it's a lie. The anxiety you feel before speaking up in meetings, the exhaustion after social events where you performed intellectual modesty, the vague sense that something's wrong, even when everything looks fine, that's not anxiety disorder. That's your authentic self suffocating under the weight of who you've been pretending to be. And while you've been shrinking to fit into spaces that were never designed for your full intelligence, there are women out there who never learned to dim their light. Women who ask the uncomfortable questions, who correct misinformation even when it makes the room tense, who refuse to play dumb on first dates and somehow still end up in relationships with men who are intellectually secure enough to handle them. They're getting the respect you want, the career advancement you deserve, the relationships you crave. Not because they're smarter than you, but because they never learned to hide it. Society doesn't fear your intelligence. It fears what happens when you stop pretending to be less than you are. Because the moment you refuse to shrink, you become a mirror reflecting everyone else's mediocrity. You become the living proof that the emperor has no clothes. You become Socratic, the one asking questions that make people's carefully maintained delusions collapse. And that makes you not just intimidating, but genuinely dangerous to every system that depends on women's complicity. Your grandmother played small because she had no choice. Your mother played small because she didn't know there was another option. But you're about to learn what Socrates knew. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who asks the right questions. The question is, will you keep performing intellectual modesty for the comfort of people who don't deserve your consideration? Or will you reclaim the intelligence you were taught to hide? 5 years from now, you'll either be exactly where you are now, still softening, still shrinking, still wondering why nothing ever changes, or you'll be the woman who decided that other people's comfort was no longer more important than her own integrity. So where did this conditioning come from? Why are we, as intelligent women, trained from childhood to make ourselves smaller? The answer goes back further than you think, and Socrates saw it happening in ancient Athens. In 399 BC, the most powerful men in Athens gathered to decide Socrates' fate. His crime? Corrupting the youth by teaching them to question everything. The real crime? He was exposing that the emperors had no clothes, that the men running Athens were intellectual frauds. Sound familiar? Socrates wasn't born into power. He was the son of a stonecutter and a midwife, working class by ancient Athenian standards. He had no formal education, no prestigious credentials, no inherited authority. What he had was an inconvenient habit of walking through the marketplace and asking powerful men to explain themselves. Politicians, poets, craftsmen, anyone who claimed to be an expert, Socrates would approach them with seemingly innocent questions. And through those questions, he would systematically dismantle their authority until everyone watching realized these supposedly wise men had no idea what they were talking about. Here's what most people don't understand about the Socratic method. It's not about being curious. It's not about genuine inquiry. It's a weapon. Socrates would approach someone and say, "I hear you're an expert on justice. I know nothing about it. Could you explain it to me?" And the person, flattered by the attention, would confidently give their definition. Then Socrates would ask another question, and another. Each question would reveal a contradiction, an inconsistency, a logical flaw. Within minutes, the expert would be tied in knots, unable to defend their own position, exposed in front of a crowd as someone who had never actually thought deeply about the thing they claimed to understand. Socrates never told anyone they were wrong. He just asked questions until they realized it themselves. This is the most powerful communication strategy ever invented, and it's exactly why he was sentenced to death. The official charges were impiety and corrupting the youth, but let's translate that into modern language. He was making people think for themselves, and that threatened every power structure in Athens. When you teach people to question authority, to demand logical consistency, to refuse unsatisfying answers, you're not just being annoying, you're dismantling the entire system that allows mediocre people to maintain power through performance rather than substance. This is where it connects to you. When you ask, "Why do you believe that?" in a meeting, you're not being confrontational, you're being Socratic. When you point out that someone's current position contradicts what they said last week, you're not being difficult, you're practicing elenchus, the Socratic cross-examination technique. When you refuse to accept a non-answer and ask for clarification, you're doing exactly what God's Socrates executed. And the people around you respond with the same fear and hostility that the Athenian elite felt 2,400 years ago. The men who sentenced Socrates to death weren't stupid, they were exposed. And exposure is the one thing fragile egos cannot survive. Socrates had a phrase for this: "I know that I know nothing." It sounds humble, but it's actually the most devastating power move in intellectual history. By admitting his own ignorance, he forced everyone else to admit theirs too. Or rather, he revealed that while he knew he didn't have all the answers, everyone else was pretending they did. Socratic irony, claiming ignorance to expose others' false expertise. Every woman who's been called too analytical or accused of overthinking it is facing the same trial Socrates faced. How dare you question what we've accepted? How dare you demand logical consistency when we're comfortable with contradiction? How dare you refuse to pretend that shallow answers are profound? Ancient Athens had a few women who understood this power. Aspasia, the partner of Pericles, was renowned for her intellectual prowess and her ability to argue with philosophers. She taught rhetoric and influenced political thought in a society that tried to keep women silent. Diotima, mentioned in Plato's Symposium, taught Socrates himself about the philosophy of love. These women didn't ask permission to be intellectually formidable, they simply were. And they were remembered precisely because they refused to dim their light in a culture that demanded it. Socrates called himself the gadfly of Athens, the annoying insect that bites the lazy horse to keep it moving. He saw complacency as the enemy of truth and questioned everything to prevent intellectual stagnation. This is what you are in your relationships, your workplace, your family. You're the gadfly. You're the one who won't let lazy thinking go unchallenged. You're the one who asks the question everyone else is too comfortable to ask. And just like Socrates, you're being punished for it through social execution. Exclusion, labeling, the silent treatment, being called intimidating, aggressive, too much. But here's what you need to understand. Socrates chose death over silence. When given the option to stop asking questions and live, or continue speaking truth and die, he chose death. He drank the hemlock because living as a diminished version of himself was worse than not living at all. You don't have to go that far, but you do have to choose between your intelligence and other people's comfort. You cannot have both. You are not being difficult. You are being Socratic. And you're now part of a 2,400-year-old tradition of people who refuse to accept that the world makes sense simply because everyone agreed to stop questioning it. Now that you understand why intellectual questioning is threatening, let's talk about how to weaponize it the way Socrates did, without ending up drinking hemlock.
Here is what Socrates understood that modern women are just rediscovering. You don't need to prove you're smarter. You need to make them prove they're not stupid. And the way you do that is so elegant, so subtle, that they'll never see it coming. The most powerful position in any conversation is not the one who has all the answers. It's the one who asks the questions. Therapists, lawyers, and leaders understand this instinctively. The person asking questions controls the frame, the direction, the outcome. The person answering is constantly on defense, constantly explaining, constantly vulnerable to exposure. So let me give you 5 specific Socratic techniques that will fundamentally change how you navigate every relationship and professional situation you encounter. First, strategic ignorance. This is the art of asking questions you already know the answers to. Socrates perfected this. He would approach supposed experts and say, "I'm just a simple man who knows nothing. Could you explain this to me?" And then he'd watch them talk themselves into a corner. You do the same thing, but in modern contexts. In your next meeting, when someone proposes something you know won't work, don't explain why it won't work. Instead, ask, "Can you help me understand the logic behind that approach? I want to make sure I'm following your reasoning." Watch what happens. They have to justify their position out loud. And in justifying it, they often realize the flaws themselves, or they expose those flaws to everyone listening. You get the same result as if you challenge them directly, but you haven't made yourself the target. You were just asking an innocent question. This protects you from the difficult woman label because you weren't being difficult, you were being curious. Or in dating, a man tells you he's not ready for a relationship, but still expects consistent access to your time, energy, and body. Instead of explaining why that's unacceptable, ask, "Help me understand something. If you're not ready for a relationship, what exactly are you ready for? And what makes you think I'd be interested in that?" Now, he has to articulate the double standard out loud. He has to hear himself say that he wants all the benefits of your presence without any of the commitment. You haven't accused him of anything, you've just asked him to explain his logic. And most of the time, when people hear their own contradictions spoken aloud, they realize how indefensible their position actually is. Second, the mirror method. This is where you reflect someone's statement back to them, as a question. When someone says something manipulative, contradictory, or unreasonable, you don't argue with it. You simply mirror it. So what you're saying is, and then you repeat exactly what they said, maybe with a slight rephrasing that highlights the absurdity. This is devastatingly effective against gaslighting. When someone tries to rewrite history or denies something they clearly said or did, you respond, "So you're saying that conversation we had last Tuesday never happened? I want to make sure I understand what you're claiming." Now they have to admit they're lying or double down on an obvious lie. Either way, the manipulation is exposed. You haven't accused them of gaslighting, you've just asked for clarification. In relationships, this reveals contradictory expectations instantly. He criticizes you for working late, but also expects you to contribute equally to expenses. Mirror it. "So you're saying you want me to earn less money so I can be home more, but also maintain the same financial contribution? Help me understand how that math works."
He now has to confront his own contradictory demands. You haven't started a fight. You've just asked him to explain himself. Third, controlled revelation. This is about strategic timing, knowing when to reveal your knowledge versus continuing to ask questions. Most women make the mistake of showing all their cards immediately. They want people to know they're intelligent, so they lead with expertise. But that triggers defensiveness and competition. Instead, you ask questions first. You let people commit to their positions. You let them fully articulate their reasoning. And only then, when they've locked themselves into a stance that you know is flawed, do you reveal what you know. In workplace contexts, this builds an oracle reputation. You become known as someone who asks the right questions, who helps people think more clearly. And paradoxically, men respect this more than direct displays of brilliance because it doesn't trigger their competitive instincts. You're not challenging them, you're enlightening them. In meetings, instead of presenting your solution, ask strategic questions that guide everyone toward your solution. Have we considered what happens if the market shifts? What's our contingency if the timeline changes? How does this align with what worked in the last quarter? The room follows your questions like breadcrumbs, and when they arrive at the conclusion, they think they discovered it themselves. And you know what? Let them think that, because now they're emotionally invested in implementing your idea, and you get to execute the strategy you wanted all along. Fourth, the Socratic boundary. This is using questions to establish non-negotiables without stating them directly. When someone crosses a line, disrespects you, or assumes access they haven't earned, you respond with a question that forces them to justify their behavior. Someone makes an inappropriate comment. Instead of saying, "That's inappropriate," you ask, "What makes you think that's acceptable to say to me?" Now they have to defend the indefensible. They have to articulate why they thought disrespect was warranted. And in trying to explain it, they realize they can't. In relationships, this enforces standards without sounding demanding. He shows up an hour late without calling. Instead of, "You're always late," you ask, "What made you think it was okay not to call? I'm trying to understand your reasoning." Now he has to justify disrespect, which forces him to confront that it's unjustifiable. Questions create intellectual distance from low-value people. When you ask someone to explain why they think they can treat you a certain way, you're communicating a crucial message. Their behavior requires justification. And people who actually respect you never need to be asked that question because they wouldn't cross that line in the first place. Fifth, intellectual aikido. This is using someone's own logic against them. You don't impose your framework, you operate within theirs and expose the contradictions. Someone at work says the company values work-life balance, but then expects you to answer emails at midnight. You respond, "By the company's stated commitment to work-life balance, how do you see after-hours email expectations aligning with that value? I want to make sure I understand the standard we're operating under." You've just used the company's own stated principles to challenge unreasonable demands. In relationships, this is devastatingly effective. He says he values honesty above all else, but lies about small things. You ask, "You mentioned honesty is the most important thing to you, so when you told me you were working late but you were actually out with friends, how did that fit with that value? I'm trying to reconcile what you say matters with what you do." This creates cognitive dissonance. The gap between stated beliefs and actual behavior becomes impossible to ignore. And cognitive dissonance is psychologically uncomfortable. People will either change their behavior to match their stated values or reveal that their stated values were never genuine. Either way, you get clarity. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds manipulative. This sounds like game playing. And you're right, it absolutely is. But here's what you need to understand about power. It doesn't care about your moral qualms. The people who've been taking advantage of you, diminishing you, expecting you to stay small, they're not playing fair. They're using every social, psychological, and structural advantage they have. Your refusal to use strategic communication isn't nobility, it's unilateral disarmament. Socrates wasn't executed because he had answers. He was executed because his questions dismantled everyone else's answers. Your intelligence isn't the problem. The problem is you've been using it to explain when you should be using it to expose. Every time you're about to explain yourself, stop. Ask them to explain their expectation instead. Watch what happens. Intelligent women don't need to prove they're right. They need to make it impossible for others to prove they're wrong. Here's the part where I tell you exactly what to do tomorrow. Because knowledge without action is just intellectual masturbation. And you're not here to feel smart. You're here to become powerful. I'm going to give you a 7-day implementation plan. This isn't optional reading. This is your roadmap from the woman who explains herself to the woman who makes others explain themselves. Day 1, observation only. Don't change anything yet, just notice. Notice every time you're about to explain yourself. Notice when you justify your decisions to people who haven't earned an explanation. Notice when you answer questions that were designed to put you on defense. Count how many times in one day you say, "I'm sorry," before stating a boundary, or "I think," before sharing expertise. Just observe. Awareness is the first step of the examined life. Socrates would tell you that you can't change what you can't see. Day 2, strategic ignorance. Practice in 3 low-stakes situations. The barista gets your order wrong. Instead of explaining what you actually ordered, ask, "Can you walk me through what you heard me say?" Your colleague makes an assumption about your availability. Instead of correcting them, ask, "What made you think I was available for that?" Start small. Get comfortable with the power of the question mark. Day 3, the mirror method. Find one low-stakes person, not your boss, not your partner, someone safe, and practice reflecting their statements back as questions. When they make a claim, respond with, "So what you're saying is," and watch them hear themselves. This builds the muscle memory of mirroring before you need it in high-stakes moments. Day 4, boundary question. Someone will test you this week. They always do. When they cross a line, ask, "What makes you think that's acceptable?" Practice this exact phrase in the mirror if you need to. The first time you use it, your voice might shake. That's fine. Say it anyway. Day 5, workplace questioning. In one meeting or email exchange, instead of presenting your solution, ask 3 strategic questions that guide people toward your solution. Watch them arrive at your conclusion and feel like they discovered it themselves. This is how you lead without triggering defensive competition. Day 6, relationship application. Use one Socratic technique with someone significant, a partner, family member, close friend. When they do something contradictory or disrespectful, ask them to explain their reasoning instead of explaining why it hurt you. This is the hardest day because these are the relationships where you're most conditioned to shrink. Do it anyway. Day 7, integration and reflection. Journal on this question. Where have I been explaining when I should be exposing? Look at the patterns. Who gets defensive at your questions? Who responds with thoughtful engagement? This tells you everything you need to know about who deserves continued access to you. Now let's troubleshoot the fears that are already rising in your mind. What if they get angry? Good. That's the exposure working. Anger is what happens when someone realizes they can't defend their position and they're hoping you'll back down to avoid their discomfort. Don't. What if I lose people? You're not losing people, you're losing dead weight. If someone can't handle you asking reasonable questions, they were only comfortable with you when you were manageable. That's not a relationship worth keeping. Isn't this manipulative? No, manipulation is covert. This is strategic. You're not lying, you're asking. You're not deceiving, you're exposing. Strategic authenticity isn't manipulation. It's refusing to participate in everyone else's performance. What if I'm wrong? Here's the beauty. Questions can't be wrong. Only answers can be wrong. When you ask instead of assert, you're inviting clarity, not claiming certainty. You need a diagnostic framework to know who's worth this effort. Green light people respond to your questions with actual thought. They might pause. They might say, "That's a good question. Let me think about that."
These people respect intellectual engagement. Keep them. Yellow light people get defensive at first, but are educatable. They might initially bristle, but if you stay calm and curious, they'll often come around. Give them a chance. Red light people rage at your questioning. They escalate. They punish you for daring to ask. These people benefit from your silence. Abandon ship immediately. 3 things you're doing today, not tomorrow, today. Ask one question instead of giving one explanation. Find one moment where you would normally justify yourself and ask them to justify their expectation instead. Practice Socratic ignorance on one person. And journal on this question. Where have I been explaining when I should be exposing? If you're not willing to lose people who need you small, you're not ready to become who you're meant to be. The first person who gets angry at your questions is showing you exactly who benefits from your silence. You've spent years, maybe decades, making other people comfortable with your intelligence. 7 days of discomfort is a small price for liberation. Socrates didn't practice his method in his head. He practiced it in the marketplace. Your marketplace is your office, your relationship, your family dinner table. The women who will be living your dream life a year from now started asking better questions today. Now, before I let you go, there's one final thing you need to understand about what happens when you start living like this.
So here's what happens next. You have 2 choices, the same 2 choices Socrates faced 2,400 years ago. Choice 1, go back to dimming your light, explaining yourself, making mediocre people comfortable. Keep softening your language, asking permission to take up space, apologizing for your intelligence. Stay exactly where you are. Small, manageable, forgettable. Choice 2. Ask the questions Socrates were asked. Stop explaining and start exposing. Watch your entire world reorganize around your intelligence instead of trying to reorganize your intelligence around a world that never deserved you in the first place. Comment below with one question you're going to ask this week. Just one. Let's build a community of women who refuse to apologize for being Socratic. I want to see what you're implementing. What conversation are you about to change? What boundary are you about to establish? Drop it in the comments. If you're ready to stop explaining and start exposing, hit that subscribe button, because next week we're going even deeper. We're talking about Plato's cave and why most women are living in psychological prison without even knowing it. You think this video opened your eyes? Wait until you understand the full scope of the illusion you've been living in. Like this video if you're done playing small. Share it with one woman who needs permission to be intellectually intimidating. Join the 2% of women who understand that intelligence isn't something to apologize for, it's something to weaponize. 2,400 years ago, Socrates chose death over silence. You're not choosing death, but you are choosing power over comfort, and that choice changes everything. Welcome to the examined life.